So you here in the thing.
Good Vach, Diane.
Good Vach. Can you see?
Yeah, could you just angle your camera a little bit? Excellent, thank you.
Okay, so now we're ready to start. Let's admit another couple of people here. Okay. So gute Woche, and let's. This is a bit of feedback we have. I've after the shir, this was circulated to some shluchim in Europe, and one of them, following on our discussion last week about the prayer in schools, so it came up. I got a bit of feedback about the Rebbe's position in relation to about Pirsum of Sheva Mitzvahs Bnei Noach. So on the one hand, the Rebbe was very encouraging to share with almost Olam the Sheva Mitzvahs Bnei Noach. But then it came to the question of actually writing very specific guidance, and here the Rebbe stepped back. So here we have two answers of the Rebbe. The first one is the question to the Rebbe was written by Rabbi Hillel David Krinsky, that's Rabbi Yudel Krinsky's son. And he writes, since there are numerous people who are requesting material about the 7 mitzvahs of Bnei Noach, I'm asking whether it would be advisable to prepare some kind of booklet about this. Lubavitch, Lemili Bakoshois Canal, and also to prepare a booklet about Lubavitch to fulfill the request of these people who want to know more about this. And the Rebbe's answer is, Betach Yimtzer Mumche Bozeh. Certainly you'll find someone who's expert in this. Noisev al Hatzad Hahil Chosi, in addition to the angle from the halacha side, but it should be also worded besignoin shelo yargiz es hanochrim. It shouldn't incite, provoke a negative reaction from the Umas Olam. V'gam yas im loho emes, and in a way that it's not aggravating, but also be truthful. And if shalachem besofik, if there's a doubt whether that can be achieved, loy lohoitzi loer, don't publish. So the Rebbe took that stance to be very careful when you're publishing, not to cause problems with that. I'm just trying to find. Yeah. So there was another letter which unfortunately I don't have here on the screen. Similar style. The letter was written to Reb David Leib Grossbaum, who was at the time in Melbourne, around Tofshim Mem Aleph, Mem Beis, and they had taken something from the Torah anthology, where it had a whole thing about the Sheva Mitzvahs Bnei Noach, and they had asked the Rebbe advice about publicizing it, and the Rebbe says if you read it, you see some very interesting messages. First of all, you see that if you see that a woman has left her husband, even for a short time, so then there's no issue of adultery, according to what's written there. And then you also see that there's lots of things, that every little thing is, there's so many details, it's chayiv misa, chayiv misa, chayiv misa. And there's this massive difference between the way Yidden are treated and lahavdil, or Masa'elam. And therefore, the Rebbe says, lignois es kol hatfosim. to take all the journals, all the copies which have been published, and they should be put in Gnisa. They should be put in Shemus, so to speak. Then he also refers me to a talk given by Rabbi Bremel Shem Tov. This is again in those years, in the Tafshin. No, it's later, whatever. And he's talking about the fact that apparently Reb Nissen Mindel, the Rebbe's secretary, had been in Eretz Yisrael, and he had, in a public statement, said that there is a Kitzur Shulchan Aruch on Sheva Mitzvahs Bnei Noach in the pipeline. And this is several months later, 6 months later, a year later, and Rabbi Shem Tov addresses this, and he says that apparently the Rebbe had said that the reaction which he's getting is that there are Umes Ha'olam, the Nit Guter Freund, who are saying, you see, this is where the Bnei Yisrael have got an agenda and they want to impose. He heard the pasuk Alecha Yisrael, that the Eden are imposing their dictates on the Umas Ha'olam. And that was why Rabbi Shem Tov was explaining why this plan was shelved. So the Rebbe didn't want that there should be Umas Ha'olam would say, the Idzak Punkt was he's dictating to me how I should run my life. The Rebbe felt that was a dangerous situation. He felt the time was unripe as at the time when he was speaking. I'm not saying that there shouldn't be those Sforim. There are those Sforim which have been published, but I think that particularly that it should be something published by the Rebbe, by Lubavitch, which would mean this is the leadership of Klal Yisrael. If someone does it their own, an individual will publish something is one thing, but if it's something which such a central figure like the Rebbe would publish such a thing, it would certainly feed the concerns which the Rebbe raised in that in that report.
It was in an interview in Kfar Chabad magazine with Nissen Mindel, and the Rebbe told him to say that they're working on Sheva Mitzvahs Bnei Noach and preparing a Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. Then later on, a very sharp letter was sent from the Havdal Alfei Avdolos from the Vatican to the Rebbe.
Oh, really? Okay. So then
the Rebbe showed it to Nissen Mindel.
And
it was put it was shelved, that Kitzur Shulchan Aruch.
Right. So thank you for that added. And obviously, for diplomatic reasons, Rabbi Shem Tov, when he spoke in public, he didn't announce that detail. But so thank you for that extra piece of clarification. Let's go now to this sous vide has Baruch Hashem gotten quite a bit of a reaction. We spoke about this a couple of weeks ago, about 3 weeks ago. Sous vide, for those who are joining us, and I saw someone from Kharkov, and I'm welcoming you to join us. I invited several shluchim out around Europe to join us live. So the sous vide is a kind of cooking system which has been introduced and invented recently, and where you have the food is wrapped in a plastic bag, in a vacuum plastic bag, and it's left in water, and it's not very hot water. It's left there for several hours. And the conclusion which I presented a few weeks ago was that it raises a problem of hatmona b'dov ha'mesav hevel, and therefore it's not allowed. So thank you, Reb Dov Berklein, you're with us this evening. Gutavach. And so Reb Dov Ber, and probably I'm suspecting that Reb Beryl Korf was behind this, that Sinish as a poshet, and there is reason to say there's not a problem of hatmona. Also, Reb Avi Kora sent me a message. He's somewhere in north part of New York, and he was suggesting that we spoke about the kugel, about in the cholent, how you can prick holes into it, which I think I did mention. And then Reb Mendy Lent, who's a shliach in Nottingham, he sent me a tshuva of the Minchas Yitzchak to the late Dayan Westheim, speaking also about the kugel in the cholent and whether you could say it's a derech bishul. All right, having said all that, so after Reb Dov Ber told me this, I happened to meet Reb Gedalia Lieberman of Heichel Menachem and told him I'm looking for a bit more information about this. So he referred me to the Farbrengen, the weekly Farbrengen, which comes out, obviously weekly. That's why it's called that. Shmoya Shenikra, Belashon Amazon, and or a bit of Yiddish also. At any rate, so there is a Reb Chaim Hill Raskin who writes a weekly halacha column. He's a son of my first cousin, and he had written also about this sous vide, and he had written that it's not okay. And the next week he wrote the following retraction. So let's read his statement. It's been brought to our attention that according to the Alter Rebbe in Madura Basra, it would seem that sous vide in a clear package would not be considered hatmona and would be allowed, provided the other conditions in the article are met. Okay. So for those who are not familiar, the Alter Rebbe has something called Madura Basra. And Madura Basra means it's an addendum at the back of the Shulchan Aruch. And I'll confess that even when I was in Kollel, the Madura Basra was seen as off limits. It was like seen as it's such an intense part. It's such that you'd have to be a genius to work through it. But Baruch Hashem, Loyal Yisrael, Chevra have worked through it. And so we have here a piece of Madura Basra where the Alter Rebbe looks at the dinim of Hatmona, of insulating foods, and it looks like it's okay. And so on that basis, he retracted, and I sent to my my questionnaire back in the United States, who asked about it. I sent him this. So here we have, this is from the back of the Shulchan Aruch. I think it's page Tov Tef Pei Aleph, and he says that he talks about the fact that if it is see-through, so then it's let's read that brackets over here. If you remember, the precedent was that the people of Tveria put a pipe through the boiling waters of Tveria, and that was condemned under the basis that it is hatmona. So here the Alter Rebbe is saying that there the water was concealed because the pipe was opaque, even though the pipe was visible, but that comes into hatmona. But from this itself, if you read it, you can see here that if the container where the food is within the hatmona situation is see-through, is transparent, then the issue of hatmona doesn't apply. So on that basis, I'm happy to retract and say that there's no problem with hatmona with the sous vide, and it could be used for Shabbos. There's an expression, moedim de rabbanon. You're allowed to go to Rabbanim are also allowed to admit that they got it wrong. Moedim de rabbanon hainu shivchayu. All right, so Baruch Hashem, I'm pleased that we had this forum. We have this forum, and it was brought up, and so it was chavirecho yakaimu biodecho, and Baruch Hashem. So if we found a heter, I'm very pleased. Okay, let's move on. So this came up. A couple of girls asked me this week about braiding hair on Shabbos, and they know that you're not allowed to braid hair with 3 braids. What about with two? So let's discuss it a bit more carefully. It says in Pasuk that when Hashem created Adam and Chava, he first created Adam, and then Adam was put to sleep, and then he separated, and then Vayiven Hashem Elokim Satzelo. Hashem builds the Selo, the side. Vayivieh Adam. So the word Selo can mean side. It can also mean a braid, and Vayiven. So the way Chazal says, Hashem braided Chava's hair to bring her and to introduce her to Adam to make her look attractive. And he says the word Vayiven. He built, and on this basis we learn that making a braid is considered boine. And as we all are familiar, what is the definition of boine? When you take a number of components, and you bring them together and you make a structure, that's called boine. So the braid, when you're taking numerous strands of hair and you're creating a structure, that comes under the issue of the melacha of boine. Of course, it's not a boine min haTorah because it's not enduring indefinitely, but it is a Isur of Boina. So here we have in Shulchan Aruch, also Likloya Sara Bishta. I'm bringing here from the Shulchan Aruch, not from the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch, because unfortunately this is one of those pieces which are missing in the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch, the second part of Siman Shin Daled, or Daled Shin. Yeah. So Sif Chavav, also Likloya Ha'isha Sara B'Shabbos. A woman may not braid her hair on Shabbos, v'lo lahatek li also, nor to undo a braid. She's allowed to make a parting, and it's interesting. He has here the word shaitel, and the word shaitel here does not mean a wig, but it means here a parting. The Lashon of Fernanda shade, to separate. Anyway, so this is the source in Shulchan Aruch of not making a braid on Shabbos. The way I understand is that the braid is a structure which will stay. But if it's just when you've got three groups of hair, and they are braided in a way that you create a structure, and that will keep. It has some kind of permanence to it, or long endurance to it. If you just twist two threads around one another, they're going to unravel. They don't have any kiyum. Of course, it depends what the quality of hair is, but it doesn't have much of a kiyum. So I don't see that as a problem. I don't think that's the issue of making a braid, because it doesn't have any kiyum. The fact, so then I spoke to one of the girls. I said, perhaps you're talking about you take two such braids on either side of the head, and then you join them together with some kind of bobble or something. Okay, so then the bobble is holding it together. The braid is not a structure. If it doesn't have the ability to hold itself, then I don't see that as an issue of boine on Shabbos. Okay, let's go on to something now, jumping from Chaim to Chesed Mishpat. Fascinating situation. A young lad is a shtickle collector. Sorry, before we go further, I said we're going to look at the chats, so let's take a look at the chats. Is the screen share not switched on? Can you see anyone, please? Can you see the screen?
It's not switched on. You can see you were screen
No.
sharing.
Okay.
Couldn't see it.
Okay, there we go. Okay, better now? Is it visible now?
Excellent, thank you.
Sorry. Okay, thank you for that feedback. Okay. Right, so Rav Klein mentions about the divine code with an introduction by Emmanuel Shachar. And there's also, I found it useful. There's a 2-volume set called Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, I think, or it's Sheva Mitzvahs Hashem. As I said, I think there's a difference between if an individual publishes a book and when it's Lubavitch International. In my mind, I think there's a very big difference. If Lubavitch prints it, it's got a much bigger clout, so to speak, and therefore I understand why there would be the reaction to step back. An individual publishes a book, so what? There's thousands of books being published every day, and so I don't think it's the same thing. Okay, let's come back to our topic. The question 4 on the list is that there's a young lad who's a bit of a collector, and he picked up an old Gemara, and this Gemara had in it a name of a previous owner. He recognized it was some Rebbe She'enikel. He didn't realize what value it was, and he showed it to someone who is a Rebbe She'enikel. Someone in the Polish Rebbes, they're all intermarried in any case. So it happened to be some relative of his, and he bought it from him for a minimal sum, for some £15. And now this lad now 10 years later, he looks and sees that it would be worth several £100s. So now he's asking the question: is there a issue of oinor? Oinor means you're not allowed to underpay. You're not allowed to cheat. So this very question has been discussed, or a very similar question has been discussed in the by the late Rav Wosner, and we can read that inside. I was asked by a Soicher Atikot, an antique dealer. He bought an antique book from a particular Yid, and the one who sold it knew that it was old, knew it was an antique, and they paid the price for it. Then when he came home with this antique book, this antique sefer, he sees that it's got some signature of some very prominent gadol, which shoots up the price of the sefer. And the one who sold it didn't know that he had such a value. But it's an old sefer. He didn't realize it's got a particular value because it belonged to a well-known, a famous gadol. Possibly if he would have known, perhaps also. At any rate, so now he's asking the buyer is now going to Rav Wosner and asking, does he have to go and pay more, or perhaps not so. And here's a fascinating psak of Rav Wosner. He says, when the first dealer, when he bought it, he bought something in his mind which was worth, let's say, 100 shekel. Although in it there was a hidden value of 1,000 shekel, but when he bought this article, he only bought a value of 100 shekel. I want to show you a fascinating, it's not exactly the same, but it's a similar situation. This is going back about 30-something years ago, and a fellow who was working as a plumber inside a house here in Stamford Hill. And as plumbers need to do, they sometimes have to climb into places where most people don't venture. So he was doing the plumbing, and he found somewhere tucked away in the woodwork, he found a bag of golden sovereigns. For those who are not part of the British Empire, golden sovereigns are old golden coins, which would probably each be worth $100 each, perhaps, today, or perhaps more. Pardon my ignorance of the value of golden sovereigns today, but a very expensive thing. So now this plumber asked the question, does he have a chiyuv to tell the owner of the house, I found these gold sovereigns tucked away in your woodwork? And I looked into it at the time, and I came to the conclusion he does not have to. There's a concept called kinyan chotzer, and kinyan chotzer means there's a concept called kinyan chotzer, but kinyan chotzer is only for the stuff which you anticipated that would be found, which could be anticipated. So you have sometimes an animal loses its way, it breaks its leg. Okay, that's one thing, but something which it would never have dreamt that it wouldn't expect it to be, kinyan chotzer doesn't apply. So if any of us learned a bit of Gemara, we learned an Elam Etzias about stuff which the Amorim had left tucked into the houses. And let's say you bought a house from a previous fellow who had a house from the Amorim which had a hidden treasure. It doesn't go back to the previous owner. When he bought the house, and when you bought the house, you were not koina those hidden treasures. You were koina the things which were obvious or close to obvious. The things which are totally hidden, you were not koina. And so the Shevet HaLevi takes this further. Not only kinyan chotzer doesn't work for the hidden, but here, when the dealer bought a sefer with a hidden value, he was not koina the hidden value. He was koina the face value, not the hidden value, and therefore he can't claim that he was underpaid because he was never koina that. And here's the last part of that tshuva. I skipped the whole arichas, but towards the end he says a fascinating, another interesting variation of this. A fellow, there's a beggar, and so someone sends his son, go to the beggar, give him 100 shekel, and ask him for 90 shekel back. For those who are not familiar, shekel, you got a 10 shekel coin. So the fellow, the lad comes back from the beggar with 9 10 shekel coins, and this kid's fiddling around with them. It turns out one of those coins was actually a gold coin. So now the shaila is, do they have to go back to the beggar and give him back his gold coin. And the psak was no. The psak was the beggar, when he received the gold coin, as far as he was concerned, it was a 10 shekel coin. And so he was coin a 10 shekel. And therefore there's no chiyuv. This is coming back to our story with this sefer. Since you as the vendor did not realize the value of that which you had picked up, you can't claim oinoa, you can't claim that you were misled when you, as far as you were concerned, it was worth something, whatever it was, a reasonable, a much smaller amount than what you now realize, but you didn't know about that, and therefore you were not coined that extra value, which is a very interesting psak. My sympathies are a little bit with the young lad, but that was the psak. Okay, here's now another question which came up this week, and this is about using food for recreation. And I've had this a few times. That's why I spent a long time on this. So someone's asking, is there midas chassidus? Is there midas chassidus? I'm not sure. I'm not sure of the guidelines over here with midas chassidus. You give him some kind of extra bit, a little bit more, but okay. So coming back to this point 5, it's a very common thing. People use food for, take some things, lentils, and make pictures with them, and they use beans for bean hunts, and then if you want to know how to make Play-Doh, you take flour and you make Play-Doh. So all of these things raise the question: are you allowed to? Is there an issue with making these products? So now, where do you find this halacha? So it's actually in the dinim of brachas on food, etc. So we have the famous Lashon HaGemara. So I'm reading from the middle of the screen. You are allowed to do your needs with bread, but the proviso of Ahanimili deloy mam isbe. It has to be that the bread does not get spoiled. But if the bread is going to get spoiled, lo, you're not allowed to use it, even though you wanted to. Yeah. So the sehilkach, ein malinichin olav bosar chai. You shouldn't put raw meat on a piece of bread. Ve'ein marivinin olav kois mola. You shouldn't pass a full cup over a loaf of bread or a slice of bread. Ve'ein soimchin boy hakaora im himalaya davos im yipel al ha pas. You shouldn't use a piece of bread to prop up your bowl of soup. The soup will spill. It will spoil the bread. And then he says you're not allowed to wash your hands with wine, whether it's neat or whether it's been diluted, even not to do with nitila for food, for bread. And then he has about not throwing bread. So here we're seeing that there's something about not using, you're not allowed to make food in a way that it should spoil. Okay, so this is the way this is the Shulchan Aruch. Now let's look at the side to the right, and here we have the Mogen Avraham. Now it says in the Gemara, he quotes from Shabbos Daf Kuf Ches, I think, that Shoyre od pas beyayin or manicha al gabe ayin. A person may dip a piece of bread in wine and he puts it onto his eye. So that's some kind of soothing of the eye. Shmami no afilo midi demamis imoisel l'refuah shori. So you see that even though, of course, bread soaked in wine is not pleasant to eat, but if it's for medical reason, that's okay. So that meanwhile, we've got to prove that for medical reasons, it's okay. Then he goes on and he says, you learn in the Gemara that they would sprinkle wine on the ground to make a nice fragrance in the house. And they would make sometimes other dips or even for soaking other things. And they would sometimes anoint themselves with wine or oil. And that wasn't for a medical reason. So what's the heter? So he quotes now the Lashon HaRambam, Ein mafsidin ha'oichlen derech bizui u'be'ito. You shouldn't spoil food in a dismissive, in a disgraceful way. Says the Mogen Avraham, Mashma de dovash hu tzoyrich ha'adam leka bizui u'be'ito. But if there's a human need being fulfilled, that's not called in a spiteful or whatever the right word is, and therefore that's okay. That's what the Magen Avraham is coming to the conclusion. And then he quotes, and that's in the first part of the Magen Avraham. Then later on, he addresses something about, it says in the Gemara about not squeezing olives onto your skin to, and so he asks, and that's because you're spoiling the olives. Here you just said if it's for anointing yourself, you are allowed to. There it says you're not allowed to. So the Magen Avraham says that's talking about when he's got some other creams, he's got some soaps or something. Therefore, he shouldn't, when he's got an alternative. But when he doesn't have an alternative, looks to on the Magen Avraham, then you would be allowed. So this is the Magen Avraham. Now let's go to the Mishnah Brura, refers to his own words in Biur Halacha. So you can use again just beneath the Magen Avraham, in the Mishnah Brura, that we've said that the Mishnah Brura came up with a new solution to the question. And he says, if it's derech ha'olam to do this, it's okay. So he comes up with a new solution. Again, what's the problem? We're finding in the Gemara various things where you are allowed to use food for other purposes other than eating. So the Mishnah Brura comes up with a solution. If that's the derech ha'olam, that's okay. And that's he proves from the sugya of ptsoyas esim, of crushing the olives onto your skin, which the Magen Avraham brings it. The Magen Avraham says the reason there is because you could use soap, but he doesn't like that answer. You find that you're allowed to put on oil, and we don't say you can only put on oil if you don't have soap. We must say, says Mishnah Brura, that when it comes to derech ha'olam, if that's a normal behavior, then that's okay. That's not called bizui eichlin. Whereas crushing olives, which have oil, that's not the normal human behavior to do that, and therefore it's forbidden. It looks at that as disgraceful. So here we're seeing two paths. One is saying that you are allowed to use foods for other things if you don't have a non-food alternative. That's Magen Avraham. Mishnah Brura is saying, as long as it's derech ha'olam, that would be okay. But it's not derech ha'olam, it's not okay. The Alter Rebbe, you can see on the top on the right side, the Alter Rebbe, as is usual, he follows the Magen Avraham, and is talking about using various liquids. I think it's for Mayim Achronim, if I'm not mistaken. He talks about using various liquids, and he says a third opinion says that even wine would be kosher in Tis Yadayim, but you shouldn't do so because of zilzul. And then in the brackets he says other liquids you are allowed to use im ein lo yimayim. So here he's saying the same thing as the Magen Avraham, that to use orange juice for Netilas Yadayim when you don't have water would be okay. So he seems to be saying the same as the Magen Avraham, that although obviously it's not derech ha'olam to use orange juice for washing your hands, but you are allowed to do so if you don't have water. So now then let's go down to the bottom of the page. We have this, everyone quotes the Ben Ish Chai. Ben Ish Chai writes the following. That about the issue of throwing foods for chos and kala, it's for entertainment. And then he says the third line, Apoi irenu, oisin lif omim beleil hamila, shulchan munach olov. They make for the night of the bris, they prepare a table which has got anafim, it's got branches and ferns and flowers, murkovim zel zeh lenoi, to make a flower display, very nice. But the goy, how do they hold over a flower display? So now they use sponges or something. Then they would make a dough. They would make a dough with flour, and they use that dough as the anchor to put in the ferns and the flowers. Then he says another thing. They take also a fruit called numi. Numi is apparently the Arabic word for lemons. I saw this in a later edition of the Ben Ish Chai. And they take it a kind of a lemon or orange, or a rimoin, which has got like a firmness to it, and they would prick the various, use this as the base for the display. And he says, obviously these fruits which are used as the display, they are certainly getting spoiled by doing so. But tzorich limchos bahem. V'layasu chazois b'shum meichel or peiris im yiyu miskalkelim venim osim. So he takes exception to this, and he says you shouldn't use fruit to as display as a display which is going to spoil them. So what are we getting from all of this? That if there is a non-food alternative available, then to use food would actually be coming into a issue of bizur, and it's not derech olam, and there's no. So the examples which I have on the list, to use tomato paste as paint, so it's a oichel, and to use it even though it's not a full, not a ready food, it's not a food ready to eat now, but it's everyone knows that tomato paste is used to made for food. To use that as paint would be lechera to both the Mishnah Berurah and the Magen Avraham would be going to the ghetto of bizur echlin. It's not derech olam, and there are alternatives. And similarly about making using potatoes, for example, as stamps. Want to make stamps, to make pictures and cut out from a potato and make it, and then dip it in watercolors and then dip it onto paper. So according to this lechera, it wouldn't be correct. No, the famous stories of the people taking potatoes and making them into lamps for a menorah. All right, if they didn't have anything else, so Mishnah Berurah will still not be agreeable. But according to the Magen Avraham, the Alter Rebbe, if you have nothing else, then you could use foods. And so you may have heard a story of someone who took a piece of bread and blocked a hole, a leak that the dam shouldn't overflow. When there's nothing else to do, so when you're desperate, then no alternative, then that would be legitimate. But when there is a reasonably available alternative, and to use food for these things, it doesn't seem to be correct.
Diane, would that apply to those toys that children have with a potato? They put in funny faces and different types of faces.
I think the question is, would it be used afterwards? And I see here a couple of people are saying, the people are older than me are saying that using potatoes as stamps is a very old practice. Derech ha'olam. I don't know. I think the default when people buy potatoes, the pashtus, they are not being bought for stamps. They're being bought as it's people are taking food and using it for other things. I don't know. Is it a Yiddish minig, or is it just like those who cut out faces from pumpkins? It's lav dafka minig Israel. I don't know. Any of you remember? There was a Yid here called a Russian fellow, passed away years ago. His name was Krugliak. And he told me that before he knew anything about Yiddishkeit, there was something which somehow someone told him, "Are you Jewish?" And what was it? It was that at the end of the meal, to gather the crumbs and put them together and dispose of them in a respectable way. And the goyim they would just throw it onto the floor, and the Yidden would have this minig of gathering the crumbs. And it looks like as part of our culture is a greater respect for food. And I was thinking, why is food so sacred? We have so we see in the food, we see that it's got a moitzapi Hashem, and so I guess there's a certain, the word sacred aspect to it, but we see here strong words not to be mevaza echlin. Now I see here my good friend from Sumy in Ukraine. He says in camp they build the Beis Hamikdash with sugar cubes. Okay, all right. Okay, let's go further. Right. Here we come to a question about Tevilas Kalim. And here's a shliach, and he's planning ahead. He wants to do a coffee evening, and Rahman al-Islam with these lockdowns. So you can't get people together for coffee evening. So his idea was to send around to each house to send a mug, which will have a specially graphic, whatever, especially for the occasion, and also a blender. And then each house they will, alle zusammen, l'shay, mitzvahs, coffee evening, and everyone will make a coffee together and blend it, and it will be a wonderful thing. The shaila is sending around these things. What does he do about tvilas kelim? The problem, what's the question? That there's kedem, when before they put the gefilte fish in their jars, they don't tovel their jars, and I don't think they get them from a Jewish manufacturer. What's the thing? The only thing which you have to tovel is klei su'uda, and stuff which is not klei su'uda, if it's not for your personal use, you're not mechuyev to tovel. Ad kedei kach, many poskim take the view that if you go that the shopkeeper cannot tovel the stuff in his shop before the customer has bought it. I used to go to domestic stores on Old Hill Street. He said, first you pay for it, and then we'll tovel it. Because so so how here becomes the question: can you tovel? Now these people who are getting in this coffee evening, many of them are likely never going to see a mikveh. And so now becomes another question: can you give them an untoveled keli? So when you got one bar mitzvah boy, is one thing. So you can take it and there's Eitzah. Shlomo Zalman perhaps talks about it, that you tovel it. You first give it to the secretary to be koin on behalf of this bar mitzvah boy, and then when he picks up when the bech is ready, he's before it's toveled. But here's a different story. Here you've got, let's say, 100 people. You're going to bring each one a mug and a blender. And what do you mean you're going to tovel each one l'shem Susan Goldberg, and this one's going to be l'shem Marianne, or whatever it may be? It's totally impractical. So here the question is: could we be koine when these mugs and the blenders? The mugs, this is a lesser problem because mugs are not really chayav with tvila. So the glazing perhaps, but if it was a glass, it would be a chayav drabonon. But here about the blender is a metal thing. It's chayav with tvila. Could we somehow buy those blenders and be kind to them on behalf of each whoever it will land, it will have been bought for them, and that concept is called breire. So you say that whoever it lands in their possession will say lechatchila it was already bought for them, was been koine, was acquired for them. So this kind of breire is used for a din d'Rabbanon. If it's a din d'Oraisa, we will not allow the use of breire. If it's a din d'Rabbanon, breire would be acceptable. So now we have to look at tvila. Is tvila a din d'Rabbanon or din d'Oraisa? So here I've got here from the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch, and it's derech agav, obviously, in Sim Shinchav Gimel, and so we have here about toveling kelim on Shabbos. So he says, first opinion is that you are allowed to tovel a keli on Shabbos, and it's not called mitakin keli, not fixing the keli, because it was usable before without tvila. And the chiyuv of tvila is midrabbonon. Now those who disagree, and then the second, further on in that paragraph, he says, there are those who hold tvilas kelim min haTorah. And therefore, we don't tovel kelim on Shabbos. But what we're seeing here, the weight is more to say that tvilas kelim is a din d'Rabbanon. And when it says kol dova tavira b'moyim, is not talking about tvilas kelim. It's talking about kashering. I didn't read now the Sikha which the Rebbe spoke when Rabbi Dayan Fisher was in there, which is printed in the Nekudas Sichos. I didn't look at it now, but here you see from the Alter Rebbe the weight is more to say that tvilas kelim is a din d'Rabbanon, and therefore it should be okay to rely on the concept of breira. And therefore, when this shliach wants to buy all these blenders, when he buys them and is coin of them, he has in mind that I'm buying it now for whoever it's going to land up. It should be theirs from this moment. So when he's kind of, it is already theirs, lamafreya, and them, yeah, right. Shlomo Fuchs is writing on the chat about excess bread. It's putting it into a opaque bag, then into the rubbish. Okay, I think that's what's actually done by the caterers. You see at the end of the chasnas, they go around with these waiters and they put them in a bag. I guess that's the best they can do. Right. Someone's writing that he was a mashgiach in a restaurant, and there were quite a few times they had two porters who were Muslims, whose responsibility was washing the dishes in the dishwasher. And before they put the dishes in the dishwasher, they had to clear the plates and throw the leftovers in the bin. They would not throw away any leftover bread and left it to one side for other people to deal with. Okay. Okay. So Arya is suggesting that we buy the blenders for ourselves and toil them. But yeah, that's a little bit. We're going to start blending it, making 100 coffees with your blenders between now and Purim. All right. Let's move on. Here again, this is a question which I got from overseas. Baruch Hashem, very beautiful front door. And he's asking two questions. One question is about mezuzah, and the other question is about Shabbos. So as you see, this front door, it looks like there's no front garden which has got a mechitza. So the question is, if it's under, if it's under the roofed area where I'm pointing now with the arrow, is he allowed to carry there? Is he allowed to carry from the house and stand over here? Is he allowed to carry from here into the house, etc.? This is the one question. The other question, I use the word stoop. That's an American word for this front area, the steps in front of the house. The Americans created another word in English called stoop. All right. So standing on the stoop, is that Rosh Hashanah or is it not a Rosh Hashanah? And then the question is, does this area need to have a mezuzah? So let's take one thing at a time. No, so we don't have it here. Let's go back. Right. So there is a concept. Sorry, I didn't have the Shulchan Aruch on the screen. It's in Siman Shin Nemvov. And the way it's written in Shulchan Aruch is, there's a concept called Pi Tikra Yored V'Sosim, which means that the edge of the roof is as if it comes down and as if it creates a barrier. So looking at the screen here, it's as if over here where I'm pointing to, which is the lip of that roof, I'm not even sure where this is, but that would create a barrier, and therefore this has got 4 mechitzas by virtue of Pitikra. So strictly speaking, min hadin, you are allowed to carry here. However, the Shulchan Aruch says that if this stoop area had less than 4 tefachim, it would not be identified as a separate reshus, and therefore it would remain as a caramelis, and you wouldn't be allowed to carry there. The Shulchan Aruch continues, and therefore, even if this area, this pitikra, is more than 4 tefachim, but people get confused. And the way it becomes fairly clear in Shulchan Aruch is that you would not be allowed to carry in this area. So again, this is open to the street. The street is either a shusarabim or a caramelis. This area, which doesn't have a proper separation from the street, has got min hadin. It is a reshus hayochid, but the Shulchan Aruch says not to carry there because of the confusion of sometimes people have a similar arrangement which is less than the 4 tefachim wide. That is as far as the question of carrying on Shabbos. The next question is about mezuzah, and I often walk up and down the streets here in Tottenham, and I see you have many houses have got a front door, and in front of the front door there's like a kind of porch, and I see a stira. Sometimes they put the mezuzah over here by the door. Sometimes they put the mezuzah on the masonry, and then you've got those who've got a mezuzah on the masonry and on the door, and it's all within about 5 houses of one another. I'm not going to tell you the addresses, but never mind. And what's tutzarda? So this is a very common situation where you've got a wider entrance and then it narrows. And the question is, does the mezuzah go at the widest point? Imagine you've got a fancy entrance, it's 3 meters wide, and then it's got architraves and whatever, what have you, and the actual door is 120 wide, let's say. Where does the mezuzah go? At the width of the 3 meters or at the 120? And it looks like, there's a discussion in Poskim, it looks like the main halacha is where you walk through, and that would really be the narrowest point. So the mezuzah belongs over here. The issues are, in addition, although I said it's a machlokas poskim about this, if you put another mezuzah here, you might actually be in violation of Bal Tosif. To having two mezuzahs on one door, if there's only one chiyuv, you're going into an issue of Bal Tosif. That's one weight, not to put a mezuzah there. Another issue, which is mitzaref lehokel, not to put a mezuzah, is the Shittas Harambam is that a doorway which does not have a door is not chayiv b'mezuzah. And therefore, Shittas Harambam, it's potem in a mezuzah in any case. Feel those who say it is chayiv, yes, you can see, like make it like a kind of sfek. It's lav davke that it belongs over here. It possibly belongs over here. And as I say, more noite that the mezuzah belongs at the narrowest plate because that's the point where you walk through. So in the notes, I have here a reference to a sefer called Seichel Tov, and that is, for myself, one of the bests for him on mezuzah. You've got, everyone's familiar with Chayvas Hador and Mezuzahs Melochim, and there's another one, Pesach Shorim, or right, so whatever they from Shechter. This Seichel Tov is a phenomenal malachit, and he takes this view and. Right, so that's, one has to make a psak. And I think I've mentioned this before. I heard once a hezbollah, why do we say the pasuk or the bracha likboya mezuzah? And if you put up several mezuzahs, when you table several kalim, you say al tvilas kalim. When you put up several mezuzahs, you just say likboya mezuzah. Why not likboya mezuzahs? So there is a shitta in one of the Gaonim apparently who says, it says in the pasuk, not Gaonim, earlier. It says al mezuzah is besecha. So there is a shitta, perhaps a Yerushalmi, some obscure shitta that you should have a mezuzah on both sides. When Chazal coined the bracha al likboya mezuzah, they also wanted to confirm one mezuzah, not two. That's on both sides. And so similarly, not to have two mezuzahs on one doorway. See, you'd be over in Bal Tosif by having two mezuzahs on one door and one doorway, and therefore, when in doubt, apparently do without. Okay. Someone is pointing out that this definition of Metzuas HaPesach is also not clear. I think you're right, because it doesn't, the verticals come over here, and then it looks like the ceiling is extending a little bit further. I couldn't see that clearly, and therefore no. So again, about carrying, the answer is that the Shulchan Aruch says you shouldn't carry over here, because of those who have a shear of less than dal tfachim, so it's like a gzeira. And as I said, mezuzah, one shouldn't put up mezuzah. So now someone's asking, is there an easy solution to make it mutter to carry? I'm thinking that perhaps putting up an extra lechi over here, a pole, perhaps like you have door handles, grab handles over here. Perhaps if you have a grab handle going 10 tfachim from here somewhere, going down till within 3 tfachim of the ground, that would be a lechi, that would be satisfy as a fourth wall. That's what I'm thinking of at the moment. Someone is pointing out to the side, this is a pillar, that's true. And he actually asked, as you can see over here, there's like a bit of a gap over here. And I asked him, how wide is this space? So this space between the two white edgings over here was 11 inches. So it's too narrow to be called a Pesach. On the other hand, he said, can you say it's just a pillar? It's not even a wall. I think it's a little bit more than just a pillar. It's not just a column. To me, it's more like a wall. And so I wasn't satisfied just to be martyr on that basis. All right, we've got one more question on our list, and that is about someone called me up on, was it Thursday or Friday? And the question is that if you make several cakes and you put them, and each one is made less than a shir challah, and then they were all put into the freezer, does the freezer make them into a chiyuv challah? So we know that there is a concept called siruf sal, which means that the basket takes, if you have numerous quantities of dough or bread, which each one was less than a shir challah, you put them all into one basket, so then they become chayiv b'challah then. And that's actually the standard practice in the matzah bakeries. They don't take challah off the dough in the matzah bakery for the simple reason they want to get those matzahs into the oven as quick as possible. So they make each batch of dough is made dafka less than a shir challah, but then they, as the matzahs come out of the oven, they are put into some kind of trolley or shelves. And at a later stage, I saw this in the the bakery there, Dubravsky and was it Korf on Troy Avenue. At some stage, they take a cloth and they cover a whole batch of matzahs, and they used the concept of tzir of sal, and then they as if they were all in one container, and then they take challah. So now the question is whether, now you've made separate cakes and put them all into the freezer. Now the freezer is like a one big basket. Now they make them into one big batch and should make a chayiv b'challah. So a couple of points here. Number one, there is a tshuva in Simach Tzedek, limud zchus, on the fact that people don't take challah from lekach. And he explains that although the broch is mezonos, but if not for the hilchas brochas, we would say actually that the cakes are more shahakol than mezonos. He's talking about a very sweet cake, like a lekach, which has got. He seems to be describing it. There's more honey than flour. That would probably be true for like chocolate brownies. As far as I know, the recipe for chocolate brownies is there's more sugar than flour. And here, certainly for that, the Tzemach Tzedek's limud zchus would certainly apply. That it's more as it's sweet. We make it mezonos because the halach is that mezonos becomes ikr, but it's more it's a shahakol in that sense. Having said that, in most houses, when you make a challah, when you make a cake, it doesn't have a shear. In the bakeries, I've checked this out. I mean, the bakeries, they are mafresh challah, because the bakeries, they make much larger trays of cake, and they are mafresh challah in the bakeries. I think they actually do it from the batter rather than from the finished cakes. Okay, and but coming back to our question, so this, what you have in front of you, is a tshuva from the late Rav Falk from Gateshead, tremendous Talmud Chacham, and he's the way he takes things apart and is really very, very impressive. So he's got a whole long discussion about this question about does the freezer make them into one batch, and I'm just quoting here his conclusion. That the loaves, to become one batch, then the loaves have to touch. Now here they are in plastic bags, so they're not really touching. So one thing, they're not touching. Another point is that they are actually in separate containers, and therefore the fact that they are in a larger outer keli doesn't make them into one batch. And he's discussed it at length. There's also another argument, which is not necessarily always the case, that is a freezer called a keli. Though generally there's a halacha in Chas Shabbos and other places that if it contains more than 40 sa'ah, it doesn't qualify as a keli. So I can't rely on that, because some freezers are actually smaller, a smaller chest freezer or whatever. And then you're going to ask, if it's a double door freezer, do you look at each one separately? So to say that that a freezer is always going to be more than 40 sa'ah, I can't say that as a blanket statement. But we have other arguments to say that since everyone puts the stuff in the freezer in bags, and the bags keep the cakes separate from one another, then therefore they do not combine as a shir challah. And right, just to finish off, I can't resist this about this whole business with the lockdown, about communal prayer. When you're down at the Omid, it's also keinen nicht moitze sein. And it's not communal prayer. Each one is davening. The fact that Emes is davened and that's zweite hert, but that's not called communal prayer. Communal prayer is one is moitzias harabim yidei chivosam. Everyone will daven, and the Eber shall so helfen, and we should risk kriegen from them goddess. And zeg zeno in ene beshuchal tzim berachmim mit Elyahu Hanovi mazon vasas I'm sur service Yeshua's v'nen chomis v'beher v'yameinu amen. A good vach.
Good vach, shkoyach.
I'm asking, are you saying you can't daven, you can't have a chazar sashat?
I'm saying, even as you're chazar sashat, you should have in mind you're not moitzi anyone. B'meile bist nicht over the minion von chas v'shalom, a communal prayer. That's my